set it up with the base behind on the party shop. So set that up. It takes a week. Yeah, you don't have to game check. It's terrible.
Yeah.
You're right. At least. It actually does it for play check.
That was more of a yeah, reverse.
Now it's.
Uh-oh.
Same like.
He does hear himself.
Uh-oh.
Well, Gary.
Whoa, 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 whoa. You better go to the altar, Missy. It's okay, we're waiting for Rob to get here.
Uh-oh. Patty just said, uh-oh.
What is going on?
There's an echo.
You know.
Patty said you're in the wrong view.
Uh-oh.
It's not in her.
Patty's not in the view. Is she not here?
Get the wax.
All right, 314, great hymns. Am I on the wrong page?
I don't know the page. 314?
Yes.
314.
I am thine, O Lord, I have heard thy voice and it told thy love to me. But I long to rise in the arms of faith and be closer drawn to thee. Draw me nearer, near, blessed Lord, to the cross where thou hast died. Draw me near, blessed Lord, to thy precious bleeding side. Consecrate me now to thy service, Lord, by the power of grace divine. Let my soul look up with a steadfast hope, and my will be lost in thine. Draw me near, blessed Lord, to the cross where thou hast died. Draw me near, blessed Lord, to thy precious bleeding side. There are depths of love that I cannot know till I cross the narrow sea. There are heights of joy that I may not reach till I rest in peace with thee. Draw me near, blessed Lord, to the cross where thou hast died. Draw me near, blessed Lord, to thy precious bleeding side.
And good evening to those I have yet to say good evening to or greet. Glad to be here tonight. Hope everyone's week is going good so far. Week's going by pretty quick for me. We had a lot to do, and I'm stuff that on top of that, we got the association meeting to get ready, and a lot of stuff that I wasn't able to get done this week, and I'm kind of running out of time because tomorrow is tomorrow, and then it's the meeting. So first things first, we have announcement wise, we're there. Once the date is set for about a month and a half, I announce meetings every service. And I do it because that's what I would want other pastors to do for our meetings. And I want other churches to come and support our meetings. I think it's good for other people to come to meetings. It's not just good for the host church, it's good for all those that attend. And so I not only do it to support the church, I think it's all good for us to go. We want to be there, support the church, and a lot of good speakers, a lot of good topics. And as I remind us every meeting, and also I always say, if pastors do their part, I solely believe that if pastors do their part at promoting churches, church services, and like I do, I ask you, I want you to be there. I'm asking you as your pastor to go if you can, and to attend. And I always found that if you do that as a pastor, people listen. People do tend to. If you can, I know that it's not always possible. So be good for you. A lot of good speakers, a lot of good topics, and you'll be blessed for it. And I've never gone to a meeting, even when life is hectic and I don't have time for it. I've never gone and not been glad not been extremely glad that I went. It's never happened. Never left a meeting and thought, well, that was a big waste of time. Wish I'd just stayed home and did my taxes, or whatever else you think is important that really isn't. A couple other announcements, and we'll make sure we get these dates right. I was a little bit confused, a little bit of a mix-up on the potluck date, but it is not, and we probably, maybe we'll have one on November 6th. I don't know, but the current idea is to have one in October. So it won't be for the youth night, it will be for a business meeting. So that is this coming Sunday. So if you did sign up, then that is this Sunday. You've got to prepare your dish. If you didn't sign up because you thought you had a whole month to do it, well, you probably need to text Treva and find out what else needs to be prepared and helped out with. So that is this Sunday. This Sunday, that also means it's business meeting. So I keep talking about what we're doing in Sunday afternoon, and we're not moving on in our current discussions of emotions. We're going to be doing business meeting in the afternoon. So keep that in mind. Keep that in your prayers as we approach that date as well. The yard sales dates are the 7th and the 8th of October. As it is right now, it was going to be held at Sharon's house. It's going to be held here because there's some issues with getting a permit. I didn't even know people got permits for yard sales. I don't know how that works. My whole life, I've never known of anyone getting a permit. Whenever we've had them grow up, we just did them. It's like, you just put your stuff out front, and so many people are doing that no one's going to stop you. But I understand wanting to go through the proper channels and do it right. I just didn't even know there was one. So there are no restrictions on church property having yard sales. So we're not under any time frames that we're allowed to, and not, we can have a yard sale whenever we want. And so we'll be doing it on the 7th and 8th. We wanted to keep the date, so we're just moving the location. It will be here. And so if you can help out on that Friday or Saturday and help Sharon out, please let her know. She can't do the whole thing herself. The 22nd is our movie night, October 22nd, and that is that for upcoming dates and events, unless I'm forgotten some. So, you can remind me. Are there any prayer requests, any announcements, any dates that I missed, or any praise reports? A trunk or treat. And I keep putting out because it's just a hard date. This is business meeting this Sunday. Let's do it this Sunday. And you don't have to have anything prepared. If you're going to be at church on Sunday, we'll do a trunk or treat meeting at 1:00. We'll eat. Or you raise your hand or fix your hair? Okay. I don't know if you had something to add to it, because I think there's no reason why the Sunday is a perfect time. It's the first Sunday of the month. We'll have all month to prepare. So trunk or treat meeting before the business meeting, that will be in the back classroom at 1:00 this Sunday. And what we'll be doing is discussing and trying to figure out who's taking on what themes for their cars. And hopefully you can be a part. Another thing, I encourage you to be a part, not the greatest holiday. Not, as far as good holidays and godly ones that we can point to God. It's not the greatest holiday, but it's something that we've been utilizing, and I don't know how, we've only had one set of visitors I know of from it, but we've met a lot of people in the community. And every year it's exciting to meet all of our neighbors And I'm hoping, and you know what's weird is like people will witness, like Sharon will tell someone, right? Isn't it? I think it was Sharon. Someone recently was talking to their neighbor about coming to church, and they were like, oh, it was Becky on Sunday. Becky was witnessing this. She was waving. She thought it was her Uber Eats. She waved them into the parking lot. And it just happened to be some people that were parked out in the street. So they drove in. They're like, yeah, you waved us in. It wasn't her Uber Eats. So instead of getting food from them, she just invited them into church. And they're like, yeah, you know, and she said, we have trunk or treat. Maybe you can come back by then. And they're like, yeah, we've been to your trunk or treat. So people remember us, and that's good. And maybe that will be maybe not the main place we invite people, but just a way of establishing connections so that when we reach out to them, that there'll be opportunities. So trunk or treat's great. And I wasn't really too looking forward to the first one. I didn't really know what it'd be like. And then we've had a few, and they've been great. And always been excited to meet our neighbors. So we'll use that pagan holiday and we'll witness to people about God. That's what we're going to do. Any other announcements, any prayer requests, anything else on your hearts? I feel like I'm missing something, but we will just acknowledge that there are a handful of ongoing prayer requests. Let's remember those that have been asking prayer requests and that they're still being, still concerns, specifically Dave and Barbara and their health. So let's remember all these ongoing prayer requests. Any last chance? Anybody else? All right. Let's go ahead and stand at this time. And I'm getting better about this, right? I'm finally learning. We can stand after this and do prayer and then get into the Bible study. Sister Sharon, will you lead us in prayer, please?
Our Father in heaven, we thank you for this time. Let's gather here, and those that are having difficulty health-wise, that you be with them and continue to watch over them and bring them back to us. Those that are not here, that their hearts be changed and come back and be in the service with us. We are a family, and we want to continue to be. I just thank you for all your blessings that you've given me. Thank you for reviewing. Thank you for our pastor, for his family, for each and every member, and the needs that they have on their hearts, that you would just hear them and through Jesus Christ, that the changes be made for them. And those that are just trying to make it, just help them, and each one of us help each other. I do thank you for the church here, spending the life with it. In Jesus' name.
Amen. All right, 7:15. Let's get moving. Let's turn to Judges chapter 3. So we've been doing quite a bit here in Judges the last week. Last Wednesday, we spent a decent portion here, Judges chapter 2. And Sunday, we introduced the sermon through Judges chapter 2. We'll be in chapter 3. I thought about a few places that I could have read, but I'm trying to keep, I want to keep the reading down. I don't want to say down, but and then make points without reading all the verses I have to here. Chapter 2 goes on to really give a great outline and kind of like a really general idea of the result of them not driving out the inhabitants. And that's what we dealt with last week, as Israel was given the land of promise and is becoming this, establishing themselves in this promised land that they would receive. Their first mistake as inheriting it was not driving out the inhabitants completely as they were instructed. And so it was obviously their first mistake because they're making it as they were doing it, as they were taking the land of promise, as they were claiming it. They didn't do what God had instructed, and that was what we dealt with last week. The first and greatest mistake they made was not driving out the influences that were there. And we liken that, I should say, liken that to the idea of when we are, coming into a relationship with God and starting to serve him with our life, that it's important to drive out the flesh and drive out the negative influence, the outside influence that would hinder us. And those things were true for them. Certainly they're true for us as well. And that was their first big mistake. I've already pointed out what we were going to be dealing with tonight. I pointed it out Wednesday. I pointed it out Sunday. And that is that tonight we'll be dealing with their second really big mistake. And this came hundreds of years later, but I still think both of them worked hand in hand for the things that really caused them to get so far away from God. We'll see through Judges. So we're not going to get really we're going to spend a little bit more time in Judges here. And then we'll get to Kings or 1 Samuel, get to the Kings. But the second great mistake they made was they wanted a king to be like all the other nations. That's where we're going with tonight's lesson. One of the big differences is that, we'll see they made mistakes through Judges, but a whole lot more time of faithfulness than wickedness. And we can say that's absolute. We'll at the end of us going through dates and times, they had a lot of issues through the book of Judges. And all of this is as a result of not driving out the inhabitants. They didn't do what God said. They didn't remove the outside influence. They didn't remove the other gods. And so as a result of that, they kept falling back into sin. But as we see, as we get through this, when we get to the end of it, they spent almost 3 times longer under Judges as they did under serving other nations. So we could say that there was a whole lot more time of good than there was time of bad. But once they get to the kings, especially when you get to the kings of the north, the nations of Israel, it's just bad after bad after bad. And the southern nation, you'll see good and bad and good and bad and good. You get a little more back and forth in Judah, but Judges, yeah, there's some back and forth. We're going to point that out, all as a result of not driving out the inhabitants. But I would also say, as we're about to get into this, more good than bad. More good, at least more time under Judges than they spent under the rule of other people. Let's look at some verses real quickly in Judges chapter 3, verse 5. The sons of Israel lived among the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. They lived among them. All the verses that we read about beforehand was that they were going in to drive these people out. That's all we read up to this, again, all the verses through Moses' life and him and his promises concerning the land that they were going to take this land where these nations once lived, where they currently lived when Moses spoke it. But here we are in the time when it was supposed to be Israel's and Israel's alone. And yet, of course, they were surrounded by these other nations still, but also in their midst, there lived these Canaanites and Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And they took their daughters for themselves as wives and gave their own daughters to their sons and served their gods. And we see one of those results. And I don't want to spend any time because we already kind of made our point. They didn't drive out the outside influences. But one thing we can definitely say here is the absolute importance of of encouraging and finding a spouse for our children and encouraging them to find someone within the faith. And that's an absolute thing. Many have married outside the faith or found people outside the faith and won them to the Lord. And we praise God over that. And I trust in those situations that God led in that. But we also see those that don't, and the wearing and taxing that this the taxation this has on their marriage. Marrying someone who is not a believer, is not someone who wants to serve God. And even people outside of the faith. Who's Dr. Laura? I remember that was someone that people used to love listening to. I never listened to Dr. Laura, but my understanding was, and this was something I think my mom said, is that even Dr. Laura would teach people, though she wouldn't tell them what to believe, but if they were marrying someone, to marry someone within their faith, because it holds a whole lot higher likelihood of their marriage making it. People that are married with different backgrounds or different religions have a much harder time. We can see definitely there's encouragement in the Word of God that we find spouses within the faith. In this case, there was a giving of daughters and sons and marriage with other people and exchanging of sons and daughters. And we see that had a horrible effect on God's people over the generations. Having this, grandparents and this being of the genealogy of other people, and then their gods being passed on. So this was something that would go on to plague them. The marriage of with other nations, their gods, again, serving their gods. We ended last week talking about it. But we also concluded talking about the consequences. And that was that immediately after that first generation, the generation of Joshua, as soon as that generation died off, the next generation went on and started serving Baal and the Ashtoreths. So it was one of those things that had immediate effect. And this would be a struggle, a back and forth struggle all through the book of Judges. So I want to move through Judges because I think it's important to go from they went into the land, they didn't do right by pushing them out, and then driving out the inhabitants. And we see that this led to other gods, which led to other people intermarrying. And this ultimately led to them making the decision they wanted kings to be like all the other nations. And so all this kind of gets there. So to pick up in verse chapter 3, where we were, and then read verses 7 and 8, the sons of Israel did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and forgot the Lord their God and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Then the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, so he sold them into the hands of Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia. The sons of Israel served Cushan Rishathaim 8 years. So as we were reading in chapter 2, right after the paragraph, verses 11 and 12, it talks about that next generation immediately started serving the Baals, started serving other gods, and there's consequences. Chapter 3 is where we start to go into more detail about what happens here. Going into more detail, they find themselves under the Mesopotamians and serving them, and Mesopotamia became lorded themselves over Israel for 8 years. So 8 years was the consequence, immediate effect. So after 8 years, God rose up a judge, and this would be the reoccurring themes. We're only going to read some of these verses, and then I'm just going to start mentioning names and dates because this becomes very repetitious. And, just to go through it all today and make sure I didn't miss any, I guess there's probably websites that could have done a lot quicker, but I like being thorough and making sure I go through each judge and each time of falling away and make sure I get the dates right. And then, of course, try to make sure that I'm on top of all the stories. So we'll just read a couple verses, maybe a couple other places that there were judges. Verse 9, when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord raised up a deliverer for the sons of Israel to deliver them. Othniel, the son of Kenaz, it's Caleb's younger brother. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he judged Israel. When he went out to war, the Lord gave Cushan Rishathaim, king of Mesopotamia, into his hands, so that he prevailed over Cushan Rishathaim. So I'm finally done saying that guy's name. We're past that part. Smooth sailing from here. Verse 11, then the land had rest 40 years, and Othniel, the son of Kenaz, died. As we see, Othniel was relation to Caleb, and he rose into being this judge and a lot of times as judges, you would see they would kind of play multiple parts. They would be a spiritual leader. They would become a military leader, and then they would judge God's people over civil matters. In order to establish themselves as this judge to oversee and help overlook the things going on, the dynamics, the issues going on within the people of Israel, in order to kind of establish them as that judge, they would come out and they were the one that God would use, be that instrument of God to go out and lead God's people into being delivered. So God brought deliverance through the judges, and then he proceeded to use these judges to be a representative of God. God was the king. It's the whole point of tonight's lesson. God is the king. They went through hundreds of years in the nation without kings, just with a man of God, or in one case, a woman of God being a judge for them. And this was all without kings. God was their king, but he would use these men and women, this men and woman, to be his instruments. So they served Mesopotamia, and then God brought a judge, 8 years serving, and then 40 years being under God's righteous reign. And as it said here in verse 11, then the land had rest 40 years. Speaking of the land having rest, that's where we'll conclude the lesson tonight. The judgment on the kings was that after the kings had been established, the land no longer had rest in the way that they had been given instruction to have a Sabbath year for rest. So obviously these two expressions are used differently. The idea that the people had rest here, but interesting that it says the land had rest 40 years. And then, currently, that would go on to be the downfall of Israel, is that they would no longer have Sabbath years, and this would bring about captivity. So 8 years under the rule of another people, 40 years under God and serving with the land having rest, the people having rest. In chapter 3, right after that, verse 12, and I want to say this just to make the point, 40 years and then immediately. Now the sons of Israel again did evil. This is the way it always followed. A judge would reign, he would die, and the people would fall right back into the same mistakes. It's like that. I saw this video a while back, and I remembered I received it from a couple different people. Derek was one of them. Sent me a video, and it's such a great video of that sheep that was stuck down in the wedge, and they get him out, and then the sheep starts frolicking off, and it ends right back in that trench later on. And the great joke. I mean, it's just such a funny example of God's people and how God delivers us, and then we fall right back in the same situation, the same exact hole, not a different one, just a hole farther down the road. So, that's us. That's God's people. That was Israel. And then that's mankind. We just keep doing the same thing. Now, the sons of Israel again did evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord strengthened Eglon, the king of Moab, against Israel because they had done evil in his sight. So, verse 14, the sons of Israel served Eglon, the king of Moab, 18 years. The judgment gets more severe. Should have learned from the 8 years before, the 40 years of deliverance. And so God brings up another man of God, Ehud, verse 15. But when the sons of Israel cried to the Lord, and I'm setting up this precedence. When they did wrong, when they did evil, God brought judgment. When they cried out for deliverance, God brought a deliverer. There's this idea here of, falling into judgment and then coming out of it into a new beginning, into a deliverance, a new chance, a new opportunity. And we're going to see these numbers actually all add up to some things that mean something. The idea of going into judgment and sin, and then the idea of deliverance. We kind of see, and this is a prelude, we see kind of the number 3, God going to the grave 3 years, and then the idea of deliverance. On the 8th day, Christ came out of the grave. Of course, the first day of the week, but the 8th day, 8 represents the idea of a new beginning of deliverance. So we'll see those numbers 3 and 8 pop up at the end of Judges. So they go into judgment, they come out again. God brings out a deliverer. So without reading the verses, God brings deliverance. They had rest through Ehud and Shamgar. You can read about Shamgar as well. It doesn't say how long one reigned or the other. It just says that under Ehud there was 80 years, but then it talks of Shamgar. So you come to a conclusion. These two men judged over Israel 80 years. And we start off by seeing 40s. 40 is an important number. So here's we see 40 separated between two men. 40, we've talked about all these numbers in the past. Numbers are a big part of this lesson, but I'm trying not to dig too deep into it. But 40 is an important number because it represents that idea of being tried and tested and going through hardship, obstacles. And, 40 years they were sent into the wilderness, and, 40 days Jesus fasted. All these numbers 40 always represent a trying or a testing. And there's always supposed to be the result of drawing closer to God from these things. You were supposed to come out the other side better off for these years. And so God would deliver them out for 40 years. And you would think that they would come out and they should have been better off. But they always fell right back into the same trap. So in Judge, don't turn in. I'm just going to start telling the stories, or at least quickly glancing through it. Judges 4, we read about Canaan, because they fell back into sin. So now Canaan comes out, conquers Israel for 20 years. It says the judgment keeps getting worse. 8, 18, now 20. And then came a woman judge, Deborah. I was this close to the name Delilah coming out of my mouth. Deborah. And, she used a man named Barak. There was a partnership there, but it does refer to Deborah as a judge. And so for 40 years again, so 40 under 1, and then 80 under 2, and then 40 under Deborah. And then they went right back in. They fell again to their enemies. In Judges 6, they fell to Midian. And with the help of the Amalekites, they fell under them for 7 years. And all these numbers, all these numbers are meaningful. 8 already mentioned, 18, the judgment, 18 represents life. 20 itself is a perfect number, and 2 tens, representing 2 tens, and 7 years under Midian. And then came another judge, and man we're all familiar with, Gideon. Gideon we're familiar with because of the 300, great story surrounding him. A lot of story under Gideon, so we're not going to get into him. But how long did they have rest under Gideon? Guess. 40 years. So again, 40 years. 40, 80, 40, 40. Under these 5 people, we have 5 sets of 45 individuals who gave them rest 40 years each. Now, I'm not going to mention this man, a man named Abimelech. He kind of ruled over the people from Israel, but he was not a judge. He does not count. But he had a time where he had some authority. He was not a judge of Israel. They were not under the rule of other people. So we have this weird little blank of 3 years where they weren't serving other people and they weren't serving a judge. And I don't know what to do with these 3 years, but I'll figure that one out later. So he's not a judge. He doesn't count as a judge, and it doesn't count as 3 years that go towards them serving other people. And so maybe we'll figure out what those 3 years represent. Maybe I'll figure it out one day, what Abimelech. We'll dive into that story a little bit deeper. After Abimelech, a judge rose. His name was Tola. He judged for 23 years, and then Jair, 22 years. Then the Amorites and the Philistines came up, and they served again for 18, another number that's not a coincidence. Jephthah is known for the vow he made with God, the unwise vow that he, the first one that he would see when he got home, he would give to the Lord, and his daughter came out of the house and greeted him. And a lot of people think that meant he sacrificed her. I do not believe that. I think it cost her that she remained a virgin, and it cost her ability to be married and procreate, which was a great loss. And so her womb was sacrificed there, which was life. Her womb was sacrificed, which was a horrible judgment, but Jephthah brought that upon his family. So Jephthah was a judge for 6 years. And then we see Ibzan, 7 years, Elon, 10 years, and Ebden, 8 years. Philistines, we see this name again. They come out, and again they turned over. And this time they served the Philistines 40 years when a judge by the name of Samson arose. And Samson would be the last judge that we read about. Samson would probably the most standout person from this list of judges, probably because his stories are just the most intriguing. They're all, Gideon's are great, Jephthah's are great. I love Deborah's and Barak's. Those are great stories. But Samson's are probably the most gripping, especially because they just resonate with kids. You got the big muscular Hercules man, then you've got the woman temptress and all the back and forth and the things that he undergoes. But 20 years under Samson, and he delivered them. And people love to chastise and ridicule Samson, but he's in Hebrews 11 and is a faithful man of God. And he judged Israel righteously for 20 years. Man had personal mistakes, but he's a righteous man. But here's the thing. You see the back and forth. But when we're all said and done, under the rule of judges, they spent 296 years, and under the rule, serving other people, 111. So almost 3-1. And if you divide 296 by 37, we get the number 8. And so that's important, and Derek talks about it quite a bit. I reference it from time to time. Why the number 37? And this is kind of where I've come to grips with the number 37, is I think that's God's, it's kind of goes to another video that Derek sent me where these scientists think that aliens signed our DNA with the number 37. But as we know that those things aren't a coincidence, the number 37 is related to our DNA, and it was signed by God. And we see God putting these stamps on things. It seems like the number 37 is the stamp. It's his approval. It's in our genetics, but it's specifically about the word of God. It's everywhere. It's this number 3 and 7 have their own the two most important numbers in the entire Bible, the two most prolific, and number 7 stands out the most. 3 is right there with it. We also understand that Christ was in the grave 3 days. The day of rest is the 7th day, that the day of rest is also the 3rd day from Christ. And there's all these relationships, even to the numbers 3 and 7. But one thing, just to make this simple, is that it's God's signature. It's a thumbprint. It's a stamp of approval. And so we see 37, we see 296 years under Judges in the book of Judges, divided by 30, which represents 8. And I'll come back to number 8 in a second. 111 years under the judgment of God, divided by 37 is 3. All those numbers, 111, 222, 333, 444, 666, it's 888. They're all divisible by 37, all have their own meanings. 666, man of sin, 777, Christ, 888, Jesus, all have their meanings. But 111 divided by 3, 37 equals 3. So this is the two thoughts I wanted to just bring out. The number 8 represents this idea of a deliverance, or kind of this new hope. It's just to make this clear so you get a visual from it. If there are 7 days, 7,000 years, the first 6,000 are the reign of man, and then the 7th year is the millennial reign of Christ on earth. And then what is beyond the millennium? The millennial reign of Christ. It's the eternal ages. It's this new beginning. And people kind of see differently on the events at the end of the 6th day, or the dates, the things leading into the 8th day. But the number 8 represents this new beginning. Christ came out of the grave on the 1st day, which would also be the 8th day. Christ came out of the grave to deliver man. He was a deliverance on the 8th day. So we see the number 8 representing deliverance or newness, new hope, new beginning, all these different things. 3 doesn't really represent judgment, but we do see how many days was Christ in the grave. And so 3 days spent in the grave. He died in our place. He took our sins upon him. He was in the grave 3 days. He was judged in our place. And after 3 days, he came out on the 8th day to deliver us from sin. So all these numbers are important. 8, 296 years under Judges, 111 under service, 8 and 3. So there's that, but then they still weren't done. There's judges that really aren't recorded in Judges. We see Samson being that final judge that is really attributed as being a judge. We also know that Eli and Solomon were judges. Eli was a judge for 40 years. We read about him in 1 Samuel. Samuel, hard to really gauge exactly how many years he judged. It was all the days of his life, but we know that in the latter years of his life, he anointed King Saul. So that's where we're going to pick up, and we'll try to get there real quick, because this is where I wanted to bring us through Judges, because I think it's important to see the effect of their sin. They didn't drive out the inhabitants, and so what happens? They fall under the rule of someone else because they didn't serve God faithfully, and then God delivered them. And this back and forth. And they go on to have these back and forth, still more good than bad, I would say, until one grave mistake. And this would even bring a further difficulty upon the nation of Israel. Imagine it being hard enough to serve God when you have foreigners and people who don't worship your God living in your midst. Imagine being members of this church, having people that were not of like mind amongst us. And that would be a difficult thing, would it not? It would be a constant thorn in our side. But it's that way when we allow them into our life outside of this. So that idea still applies. Imagine how much harder it would be when they start setting up kings instead of God. Men started being the one they looked to rule and reign over them. We as God's people acknowledge that God is our king. He is our ruler. He is our head, not the pastor, and certainly not ourselves, not our boss, and not any other man. God is our Lord. God is our head. Let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 8 and try to get through these points. Kind of falling in line with Sunday's sermon where I made mention of a lot of stories, and now we do all the reading in the last third of the sermon, or in this case, the lesson. But we can make our points pretty quick because I really want to drive these points home that at the heels of all this, where do you think the idea of wanting a king came from? They even spell it out. They make it clear themselves. They didn't just one day say, hey, we need a king. This came from the influence that they didn't get rid of and they allowed to live in their midst. And so because of it, they allowed the gods of these other nations in. They had family and, different people that were outside that had influence over them because of the people that they didn't drive out, the gods that hindered them, that were thorns in their side. So where did this idea of setting up a king instead of having God be their king, where did this idea came from? We all know, I've already mentioned it tonight. It came from these other people. They wanted a king to be like everyone else. Chapter 8, verse 1, and it came about when Samuel was old, he appointed his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second, Abijah. They were judging in Beersheba. They never really got up there, and Samuel was the judge. They really never got to judge. His sons, however, did not walk in his ways, but turned aside after dishonest gain and took bribes and perverted justice. And so Samuel was trying to set up his sons as being the next judges. It wasn't happening. Now, I'm not saying there was an issue when Israel stood up and said, these men will not be our judges. They had no business being judges. And I think maybe the one and only mistake we could even possibly look at in Samuel's life is that he was trying to set up his sons as judges, but I'm not judging them because the Bible doesn't. Eli got judged because he didn't come down on his sons. Eli got judged. Samuel did not. So I'm not trying to judge Samuel, but he was trying to make his sons judges, and they weren't following in the footsteps of their father. And this was an issue here. They perverted justice. They took bribes. Obviously unacceptable. Verse 4, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah. And they said to him, behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint us a king for us to judge us like all the nations, or like all the other nations. And this would be, something that they had this idea. And this would be the first thing. It started with this idea. Of course, that came from the outside influence. And eventually these outside influences had its way until this started becoming, maybe this is good for us. And it's why we get rid of outside influences. Outside influences have this way of over time wearing us down until we start thinking, well, maybe we should try this king thing out. Let's try it. We want to be like them. Why do we got to be so different? The number one problem that I think number one, we don't get rid of the flesh. We don't get rid of outside influences. But one of those common things for God's people is when we start allowing the influences of these people in and start wanting to be like them. And so they started wanting to be like them. That's the result of not getting rid of outside influences, not putting them in their place, not sanctifying oneself, setting oneself apart. It wears on us, and our flesh wants to be like them. And it's the worst thing that we could ever do as a Christian is want to be like someone who doesn't follow God. It's the number one thing we warn our children. Don't be peer pressured. They don't know the Lord. They don't know what's good and bad. They're not right. So we warn them. We ourselves need to be warned. Let's not fall into the same trap to be like others, that in order to fit in order to show us that we're like them. the exact opposite of what God has called us to be. We are to be set apart. And so drive them out. Drive out the flesh. Set yourself apart, that you don't be one of those that want to be like all the other nations. But they wanted to set up a king in their life. Of course, the whole point of this is that God was their king. And so the huge mistake of wanting to replace God in your life. And what a devastating thing for them, and what a devastating thing for any Christian. To set something else up where God belongs. Things that don't belong in certain places of our life and our heart and our mind, that only God belongs, and yet our flesh desires these things and desires to set up certain things. It can be all sorts of things, money and women, our jobs, sports, all sorts of things that people put up to rule and reign over their life. They set priority over all other things. People, it's like people come to church and then they're keeping score in the game. I don't got a problem when people do that after church, but these things don't belong here. And our concerns for work and stuff like that, they don't belong when we're serving God. Put God first. Those things, they don't even come second. But our flesh has a way of putting these things up where they don't belong. So they wanted to be like all the other nations. They wanted to set up other kings where God belonged. And so this thing displeased Samuel in verse 6. But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel when they said, "Give us a king to judge us." And Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they have said to you. For they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." Let's get down to verse 9, and I'll make some comments. "Like all the deeds which they have done since that day, since the day that I brought them up out from Egypt, even to this day, and that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now then listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them." We'll get to the warning in just a second. But, we've gone through these verses before, so I'm really trying to just move through them tonight at a decent speed. We've gone through a lot of these stories, a lot of these verses. I know I've talked about this before. I think about a year ago, we talked about, we went through these verses. So you don't need to go too much into detail, but as God makes this point, as they're wanting to set up a king, and he reminds Samuel, this isn't a rejection of you, this is a rejection of me. And when we reject the things of God, when we reject church from our life, when we reject the things of God, the word of God, and talking to God, we have to acknowledge, and we set up things where they don't belong. This is a outright rejection of God as king in your life. And we need to make sure that we're putting God where he belongs. He needs to have precedence over all things. He is our Lord. He is our Savior. He is our King. We need to make sure he's there at all times. Not just at church. We come to church. It's easy to acknowledge God as our God, but he is our King. He is our Lord. He is our God. Every moment of our life, when we step foot out of those doors, and when we go to work, and when we go home, wherever we are, God is our King. And we need to not set up things in his place where they don't belong. When we reject the things of God, we are rejecting God. That's the thing. When we reject the things of God, we're rejecting God. And I don't want to set up this idea, when you reject me, reject God. I'm a man. But when we reject his word, where it's preached in truth, it's not a rejection of the man who spoke it, but a rejection of the God in whom, and the word in which it's brought forth from and with. And so we need to identify those things. It's not rejecting the one who brought the sermon. If my sermon's in truth, it's rejecting God. And so these are things that are important for us to do. God, and you can imagine how it must feel on God's behalf, as he even points out, ever since I brought them out of the land which they were serving as slaves, I brought them out. They've continued to struggle with serving me faithfully. And we've seen in the time of Judges that we went through tonight, the back and forth, the back and forth. And so God's finally at his end with this. He's fighting for him. You see, like the tug of war, he's fighting for him, And there's a point where you want something long enough until God says, all right, let me give you one last warning. And if you don't stop, I'm going to let you have it. And they wanted the people to serve with them. They wanted the people to live in the land with them. And so God said, all right, then they're going to live with you. You didn't drive them out. They're going to live with you. You want a king that bad? After all these years, finally God says, all right, I'll give you a king. Let me tell you what's going to come as a result of it. So he gives them this dire warning. Verse 10, again, I know we've dealt with these passages in the past. Let's just read them, try to get through all that I want to do tonight. So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, this will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. And the first thing you see is the sons. Who do the sons belong to? They don't belong to the king. They belong to God. And that's this whole warning. All these things that you're going to have to give to a king instead of me. And what devastation that would bring. It would result in their collapse and they're being conquered by another people and driven out into exile. Your sons won't be given to me. They'll be given to him. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. Who is the one that's supposed to get the best of our fruits? That's what they were, this big sacrifice of giving the first fruits and giving the things of God the best. And now who was going to get their best and first? Their king. Verse 15, he will take a tenth. Who was to get a tenth? Who was to be the one that we tithe to? Who was the one that was supposed to receive a tenth? God, but who would get that tenth now? The king. He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyard and give his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and the donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in the land because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourself, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. There's going to be a day that you're realizing we're still having to give all this stuff, but now it's to a man who doesn't rule and reign over us righteously. And all these things would cost them their ability to give to God properly. And when they were, it would take away their ability to have what was commanded in Leviticus. You can read about this in Leviticus chapter 25. You read about the Sabbath year. This is just like a Sabbath day. You have 6 days that you work, and then on the Sabbath day, you were supposed to do no work. That was a day of rest for people. But just like the individual and the week was laid out in 6 and then the 1, the years were laid out that way. 6 years of working the field and harvest, and then that 7th year, you were to give the land rest. They weren't going to be able to do that anymore. A king would make it to where they weren't able to have this day of rest, this year of rest for the land. And so year after year, they would give to their king, and Sabbath year after Sabbath year, they would work the field. And Sabbath year after Sabbath year, they would neglect the land of the rest for their land, and this would eventually bring consequences of judgment. 2 Corinthians chapter 36. We're going to get to these real quickly in closing. Let me get some numbers real quickly. Like I said, a lot of numbers, and this is not supposed to be about numbers tonight, but it just happened to work that way because it all has to do with numbers. There's so much more to this than I could possibly go into, even with numbers tonight, because it's not about that, but just to understand their judgment. And I've been saying God's judgment is poetic. His judgment is perfect. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth. You didn't drive out the people, therefore they're going to stay and be a thorn in your side. Perfect judgment. You set up a king. You didn't give the land rest. Well, how many years did they not give the land rest? For 490 years. That's 70 Sabbaths. 70 Sabbaths. And this is what we're going to go through real quickly in closing. So for 70 Sabbaths, they didn't give the land rest. So what did God do? He brought in someone to bring them out of the land where no one was no longer. It wasn't like he brought in other people. They came in, they took out Israel, and the land sat desolate for 70 years. The land had its rest. So God's judgment was perfect. So where were they those 70 years? Captive under another people. So God's judgment was perfect. Well, I'm gonna try to summarize all this in a second. Let me read the verses though to back me up. Second Chronicles, I don't know if I said Corinthians. If I did, it's too late to turn here. Second Chronicles chapter 36, the end of Chronicles, the end of the days of kings. We're going to go through all the kings. We're going to talk about the men, the ups and downs, the good ones, the bad ones, some of the interesting stories that caused Israel to shift and some of the major events in Israel's history. But this is the result of the time of kings. They wanted a king. They got their king. And this was the result of it. The Lord, the God of their fathers, verse 15. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore, that's one of the scarier verses in the Bible. Until there was no remedy. That idea of that there being judgment or getting to a point where there was no fixing it. That's a scary thing. That's where they got to a point where it was over. Their opportunity to turn to God had its end. And now they would stand judged by God, and there would be no more remedy. There's opportunity today, but when we stand before God in judgment, there is no more remedy. Our days, our opportunity have concluded. There is no more remedy. Therefore, he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men with the sword in the house and their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young men or virgin, old man or infirm. He gave them all into his hand, all the articles of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, the treasures of the kings and of his officers. He brought them all to Babylon, and they burned the house of God and broke down the wall of Jerusalem and burned all its fortified buildings with fire and destroyed all its valuable articles. Then those who had escaped the sword he had carried away to Babylon, and they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation, it kept Sabbaths until 70 years were complete. We're not going to turn there. Jeremiah talked about it twice. Jeremiah references it in Jeremiah 25. He references that there would be 70 years in exile. He references it again in Jeremiah 29:10. Daniel references it. I think he's quoting Jeremiah, but he references it in Daniel 9, verses 1 and 2. We're not even going to get into Daniel 9. 70 is a great number. It's a perfect number anyways, right? It is a complete perfect number. 7, as we mentioned, it's a perfect number. It's a number of completion, perfection, fullness, of oath, of fulfillment, of fulfilling promises. And so that number 7 times and rounded by 10, which in itself is a perfect number. You can just time things by 10, and typically it carries out it keeps that idea of the original number. But here in this case, I think it's all fitting. The number 10 represents really the idea of the fullness of God's commandments. How many commandments were there? God gave 10 commandments. So God's law and the fullness of God's law. And so we see that 7 times 10 is 70. The perfect number of 7, the completion, and 10, fullness of the law. And so let's conclude real quickly, tonight. And I know I went through too many verses tonight. I should have cut this into 2. Maybe the mistake was going through Judges. I should have done Judges and then this. But what I wanted to do was get through Judges because it all speaks to last week's lesson and it all gets us to the kings. And I wanted to do that historically, but I think maybe I probably overwhelmed the lesson tonight. I hope that you get something from this. Too many thoughts, I think. And that's okay. It's not that you're incapable of comprehending it all. It's just not all of them are complementary. So it's like, if you throw a rock one at a time, you can hit the target. Sometimes you grab a handful of rocks and you throw them out there and maybe one hits the target. So you kind of like, sometimes you shoot too many points out there and they kind of all tend to miss. So I hope that didn't happen tonight. So to conclude this, going back to 1 Samuel 8. Just to finish this, he said to warn them, right? Warn the people. There's still opportunity to turn. This is why I wanted to end here. We know the outcome, okay? We know they didn't. We just read the outcome. They didn't. They got the king, all the effects of the king. We'll be going through the specifics of that for the however many weeks we're in here. But this is the point why I wanted to end here. They got the warning, and they could have had a change of heart. It wasn't too late. And sometimes we're dead set on things. Sometimes we make mistakes. It's like we're just kind of stubborn. Maybe going back to last week, we don't remove the things that we need to. Maybe we're too stubborn to drive out things from our life that don't belong. Maybe we're setting things up in our life that don't belong. We're too stubborn to remove them. But here's the thing. As long as God is preaching at you, there's opportunity. I hope that you don't let the day pass you by when you deal with the things that God is convicting you about, because there was opportunity right here. They got warned. And my sermons, my lessons, the idea of it, the word of God, his spirit is here to warn us. The Spirit of God, that's what he does. He warns us of the consequences of sin and judgment. Verse 19, nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel. And they said, no, but there shall be a king for us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Who was supposed to go out before him, fight their battles? The Lord. Now, after Samuel had heard all these words of the people, he repeated them to the Lord in the Lord's hearing. Verse 22, the Lord said to Samuel, listen to their voice and appoint them a king. Samuel said to the men of Israel, go every man to his city. So you want it, you got it. And we got to be careful about the things we allow to linger in our life. You want it, you let it linger. Maybe, just maybe, you get delivered over to it. And I pray that that day not come, that as long as God is working, that we listen and that we heed the warnings of God. So great mistake number 2, and that kind of gets us where we need to be to kind of get into this. They didn't drive out the inhabitants, and they set up men as kings to rule over them in place of God. Let's go ahead and stand. And any last words, any prayer requests, any thoughts on your hearts before we go our separate ways? All right, if we're all good to go. Eric, will you dismiss us, please? Amen.